So the Christmas season is well and truly over. We've finished our series where we were looking for the light of God, the light of Jesus. And we're moving on now to a series that we're calling Fan or Follower. And the idea of this series is that we're raising the question, having found Jesus, the light of the world, are we going to be a fan of his? Or are we going to be a follower of his? What's the difference? Now, if you've seen the promotional graphic that we've done for this series, the little picture thing, you'll see that it looks like it's got a bit of a football theme going on. And this is where those of you who are football fans and who are perhaps looking forward to a whole load of football analogies that you're going to be able to relate to, I'm really sorry to disappoint you here, because my knowledge and understanding of football basically goes as far as knowing they kick a ball around on a field and they try and kick the ball into the goal. That's about it. I know no more than that. You're not supposed to touch the ball with your hands unless you're the goalie, I think. I really know nothing about football. But for me, when I was thinking about fan or follower, what it reminded me of was how those terms are used in social media. Way back in March, when we first started doing our Sunday services online, when the first lockdown started, to start out with, we were doing them as live streams on Facebook. And one of the things that I quickly noticed there was, as people were commenting on the live stream, some people, when their comments came up, you'd have their name and next to it, it would say top fan. Now, some of us may have got a little competitive about this, wanting to be classed as a top fan. And basically, as far as I could work out, being a top fan basically meant that you were one of the people who commented lots on the video, or that you did lots of likes during it. That made you a top fan. Are we a top fan of Jesus, commenting lots about him and giving him lots of likes? Or are we a follower? The term follower I've come across on Instagram. I'm not quite as good on Instagram as I am on Facebook because I'm old and past it, according to my teenagers. But basically, as far as I can tell, on Instagram, people choose to follow you. So a follower on Instagram is somebody who's basically looked you up and clicked to say, yes, I want to follow this person. And what that means is that whenever they log into Instagram, they see all of your posts. Your posts pop up on their feed. Are we followers of Jesus? Are we fans or followers? And if we're followers of Jesus, then I hope that means a bit more than what it does on Instagram, that it means a bit more than just following what he's up to, checking on, looking at Jesus' news feed to see what's happening in his life. So, fan or follower, that's the question we're asking this series. And we're starting out by looking at the idea of how, as a follower of Jesus, we are called by him. And we're going to do that by looking at a short passage from the Gospel of Mark. Now, you may know that there are 4 different Gospels found in the Bible, each of them giving an account of the life of Jesus, but by different people and from different perspectives and with different purposes. So they all have a slightly different feel. And Mark's Gospel, to me, it's described as one of the synoptic Gospels, so it just tells the story. It's quite straightforward. Mark gives a really nice, simple overview of the life of Jesus, and he just tells it in quite a simple way. It's a great one if you're wanting a Gospel to read through, just to give you that overview of Jesus' life. It's a great Gospel to do that with. But just because it's quite a straightforward Gospel in that sense, doesn't mean that it lacks depth. Because as we'll see from this one little passage we're going to look at, we can glean so much understanding from the telling of the story that Mark gives us. So let's start out by turning to Mark chapter 1 and read about how Jesus called his first disciples.
As Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. "Come, follow me," Jesus said, and I will send you out to fish for people." At once they left their nets and followed him. When he had gone a little farther, he saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John in a boat, preparing their nets. Without delay, he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men and followed him.
Alfie, come! Good boy, Betty. Over. Over. Read. Good boy, well done.
A round of applause for Alfie's amazing talent there. You know, calling Alfie and him following me like that may, on the surface, look like quite a simple thing. But actually, any of you who've had dogs know that training a dog to come when called and to follow you can take a lot of time. It has to be built up very gradually. Right from the beginning, when they're a tiny puppy, you just teach them to recognise their own name. So with Alfie, it was every time I said Alfie and he looked at me, I'd give him a treat so that he'd know, oh, if I look up when she says Alfie, I get a treat. And you gradually build it up and up based on the idea of teaching them that if they come to you and follow your commands, they get treats. So the experience of following you is better than the experience of not following you. And I suppose in a similar way, as we read that account in Mark's Gospel of how Jesus called his disciples, on the surface, it sounds like such a simple thing. Jesus said, "Come, follow me." And they dropped what they were doing and they followed him. So simple, so easy. And yet, as we dig into what's going on in this passage, there is so much depth there. It is much more going on than just what Jesus said and them responding. So let's try and imagine this scenario ourselves. Jesus is wanting to draw together these followers, these disciples, who are going to spread a world-changing message with him. The work they are going to have to do is going to impact thousands and millions of lives. How is he going to start recruiting his disciples? How is he going to recruit his followers? Perhaps take a moment yourselves to imagine that you had some world-impacting project that you were leading. I don't know, maybe it was coming up with the COVID vaccine. How would you begin to recruit the team that you needed in order to make that project happen? We're going to try something perhaps a little bit new, because when I preach in real life, I love to have a little bit of interaction with everyone and hear what people are thinking. So why don't you now, either just in your family at home, or if you're able to on the chat function here, why don't you post there some of your thoughts about how you would begin to recruit your team for this world-changing initiative? And I'll be back with you in a minute after you've chatted. I wonder what thoughts you came up with there. Perhaps you were going to advertise somewhere to find people who had the right skills for the task ahead. Maybe you were going to direct your advertising to a place where you knew. So if you were looking for people to help with developing this vaccine, perhaps you'd go to the universities where all the top scientists are and advertise for your team there. Maybe you'd make some personal phone calls to connections that you have. I don't know. But let's look at how Jesus goes about recruiting his followers. So it tells us that he was walking by the Sea of Galilee and he sees Simon and Andrew and he says to them, "Come and follow me." Now, one thing that we do need to be aware of is that he does already know Simon and Andrew. These are not completely new strangers to him, which is something that I often thought when I was young. You think, wow, he just went up to these random people and they'd never even heard of him before and they followed him. It's not quite that extreme. So we know from the Gospel of John in John chapter 1, verses 35 to 42, it tells us that Andrew was already a disciple or a follower of John the Baptist. And it's through John the Baptist that he meets Jesus, and he is so amazed by Jesus, he is so convinced that Jesus is their long-awaited Messiah, that he goes and gets his brother Simon and says, "Hey, come and meet this man. It's amazing. I found the Messiah." So you might say that Simon and Andrew are already fans of Jesus. They've heard about him. They've gone, "Wow, isn't he amazing?" But Jesus is now calling them to be something more than fans. So Jesus is going to call them. He already knows a bit about them, and I imagine that he probably knew, therefore, where he would find them. I don't imagine this being Jesus just happening to be out for a nice stroll by the Sea of Galilee one day, and as he's meandering along, he happens to see Simon and Andrew and think, "Oh, you know what? Here's a great idea. I'll ask them to follow me." No, I imagine that Jesus set out looking for them, to find them. As fishermen by the Sea of Galilee, sorting out their nets is where they were going to be. That was their day-to-day work. And so I think Jesus went looking for them where he knew he would find them. Jesus chose Simon and Andrew, and he went looking for them to call them specifically. Jesus calls us. He chooses. Let that one sink in for a few minutes. You know, you may have heard about Jesus and you may have thought just in terms of your choice of, "Oh, I'm a fan of this guy. He sounds great. Shall I follow him or not?" But actually, Jesus chooses you. He's the one that chooses you. Yes, you have a choice over whether you follow him or not, but Jesus seeks you out and calls you to follow him. He finds you wherever you are, whatever he knows you'll be doing, and calls you. And if you struggle to believe that, let me read you a couple of verses to emphasize that. First of all, from John chapter 15. It says in verse 16, "You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you so that you might go and bear fruit, fruit that will last, and so that whatever you ask in my name, the Father will give you." And if that's not enough to convince you, let's flip over to Ephesians chapter 1. And it says right at the beginning, in verse 4, "For he chose us in him before the creation of the world to be holy and blameless in his sight." He chose you before the creation of the world. He came looking for you and called you to follow him. And that following is more than being a fan. You know, Simon and Andrew had got excited about Jesus. They were absolutely fans. Andrew had been so amazed by him that he went to tell Simon, "Come and see this guy. He's great." But now Jesus has come to find them. They've gone back, having said, "Wow," they've gone back to their day-to-day work. They're getting on with their lives as they were before. But Jesus comes to call them out, to say it's time to leave what you're doing. It's time to leave your day-to-day stuff from before, and it's time to step out and follow me. You know, the great thing about doing sermons online is that when I look at the camera, I can be looking at each one of you individually. I know if you're preaching in person, you have to kind of look around the room and make eye contact with people to engage them. But right here and now, I can look you in the eyes and say to you, Jesus has looked for you. He has chosen you. You might be getting on with whatever it is you do day to day, getting on with life. And he comes to find you. and he calls you. The question is, will you leave what you're doing and follow that call? So I think a fairly reasonable question to be asking at this point, if Jesus has called someone, is for them to say, okay, but to do what? To follow you where? To follow you in what? And Jesus says to his disciples, he says to Simon and Andrew, come follow me and I will send you out to fish for people. Now, we have the benefit of hindsight. We've read the rest of the book. We know where Simon and Andrew and all of the other followers of Jesus are going to end up. We know that he sends them out in pairs to preach the good news, to bring healing as they pray for people. We know that they are going to end up standing up to authorities. We know that some of them are going to end up being arrested and imprisoned for him. We know that some of his followers are going to end up being martyred for him. But the starting point of what Jesus calls them to is to fish for people. Because Simon and Andrew are fishermen. Fishing is something they understand. Fishing is something they can relate to. And when Jesus calls them, he's not calling them just as random people. He is calling them as men that he knows, men that he understands, men that he can see specific giftings in. He calls them as they are to something they can relate to. Now, yes, he's going to grow them. Yes, he's going to challenge them. He's going to give them new gifts and new skills that will equip them to move beyond what they already know into new things. But to start with, he calls them as who they are, as fishermen. And I believe that's how Jesus calls us. You know, sometimes one of our fears in following Jesus can be, well, if I agree to follow him, what if he calls me to do something I really don't want to do? I know for me, one of my greatest fears would, and I hope he's not listening and doesn't, call me out on this, but one of my greatest fears would be, if Jesus called me to go and be a missionary in some really hot country, because I'm really not good with hot weather and I'm not good with eating different kinds of foods and stuff, and I just couldn't handle that. But Jesus hasn't called me to do that. When Jesus calls us, remember what we were just thinking about. He chooses us. Jesus chooses you as who you are. He knows your giftings. He's chosen you for a specific purpose just for you. And yes, he will grow you. Yes, he will challenge you. But he will also equip you. He will give you all the gifts that you need. He will help you to learn new skills so that you can follow his call in your life that's designed just for you. And so again, taking the opportunity to look directly at the camera so that I can be speaking to each one of you. What's Jesus calling you to do? What does he see in you that he has chosen you for? And so the passage then tells us, in response to this call, that Simon and Andrew get up, they leave their nets and they follow him. Now, leaving their nets is a significant thing. Their fishing nets were their livelihood. They were not a disposable commodity. It wasn't a case of, each week you could pop down to Tesco's and buy a net to do your fishing that week. Their nets would have been made and repaired time and time again. Each time they'd been used, after they'd brought in their haul of fish, they would then, before going out again, check over their nets, carefully repair any holes so that they could use them again. Leaving their nets wasn't a simple thing of, me putting down my Bible and walking off. It was leaving their livelihood behind. It wasn't something that they could just pick up again later. What an amazing thing to just leave that behind. I try and think what the equivalent would be for me. Maybe it would be for me to leave behind my laptop that has all of my files of all of my stuff, all of my knowledge and things I've used in the past is stored on there, to leave that behind and move forwards. Or maybe it would be for me to, abandon my bookshelf with all of the books I've acquired over the years that I like to be able to go back to reference things and so on. And so you've got to ask if they're willing at Jesus' call to just abandon their nets that they have invested in, that they rely on for their income for so long, to just abandon it. Are they just quite reckless people? Well, to be fair, we do know. So Simon, who later becomes known as Simon Peter, he's quite an impulsive man. He's the one who, when in the Garden of Gethsemane, the soldiers come to arrest Jesus, we think it's Simon Peter who's the one who chops off the soldier's ear. Peter is quite an impulsive guy. But to the extent of abandoning your whole livelihood just on a whim? We see later Levi, the tax collector. Jesus calls to him. He says, "Come on, follow me." And he just abandons. He's in his tax collecting booth and he just gets up and follows Jesus. And I often wonder, he must have had all of the tax there, all the money there. Did he not, carefully count it up and bag it up before getting up and going off for dinner with Jesus? Or did he literally just leave it there in the booth and go off with Jesus? I don't know. What is it about Jesus that compels these men at his call to just leave behind what they're doing and follow him? What kind of trust must they have in him? And how does Jesus manage to create that trust in them so quickly that they would be willing to do that? What would it take for you to be drawn enough to someone, to be compelled that at their call you would abandon your livelihood, you would abandon your plans and turn your whole life to following them? What would make you do that? Why not comment on that, reflect on it now? What would it take for you to be compelled to give everything up in order to follow someone? What would it take? Well, I don't know what you guys have commented, but for me, it would mean I would have to have such complete trust that the person calling me knew what they were talking about, that they were wise, that they had a good plan. I would have to trust that they were good, that they had good intentions for me, that they were right, that their plan was for a good purpose. I would have to trust that they actually had a plan for how we were going to do this. And for Simon and Andrew, having already met Jesus, they had that complete trust. They knew that he was good. They knew that he was wise. They knew that he had a plan. They may not have known the details of how it would work out, but they knew he had a plan and a purpose. They knew that the thing he was calling them to was a good thing. It was the right thing to be doing. And the plan that he had, his calling to them, motivated them. It excited them. It set their hearts on fire with wanting to be part of this amazing plan, with wanting to serve this amazing man. To take that step, Jesus' presence was enough to communicate that. And if nothing else this morning, my hope, my prayer is that for each of us, we will get that sense of Jesus that is so compelling that we will completely trust him with whatever it is he calls us to, that we will trust him to follow him. And more than that, that we will be excited by his plan, that we will be so eager to be part of what he's calling us into, to see his plans mapped out in our lives. That we will be so confident of his justice, of his strength, of his wisdom, that we won't be able to help ourselves but to say yes to following him. There is one last thing that I want us to draw from this passage, because this idea of laying things down, leaving our nets behind to follow Jesus, can feel quite scary, quite a big deal. But what I notice in the way he calls his disciples is that so often he calls them in pairs. He calls Simon and Andrew together. Now, that's not always the case. Sometimes he called individuals. But even if he called them as individuals, he called them into a group. He didn't call them on their own. And Jesus doesn't call us on our own. I believe that Jesus calls us to be part of his kingdom, to be part of the family of God, to be the body of Christ together. And that as he calls us together, just like we see with the disciples as we go on through this series, they rub up against each other, they challenge each other, they encourage each other, they grow together. And so I believe as Jesus calls us, he isn't calling us to be alone. He is calling us to be together, to grow together, to encourage each other, to cheer each other on, to challenge each other. And so as we sort of draw this to a conclusion, let's take a moment to reflect. Jesus has chosen you. You have a choice over whether you follow him, but he has chosen you to be a follower of his. He has come and sought you out. He knows you, he knows where you'll be, and he comes to you and he says, "Come, follow me." Will you follow him? Do you trust him? Do you know that he is good? Are you excited and motivated by his plan? What will you drop in order to follow him? Now, let me be honest with you, as a church, we're on a little bit of a recruitment drive at this point. We've got, as a church, roles that need filling. We've got work that needs doing. I'll be honest, we've got jobs like we need kids workers, particularly for our preschool children who we feel we're not really providing much for at the moment. We would love to have volunteers who've got the heart and the passion and the call to make things happen with that. We need more volunteers for Make Lunch and our food parcels project who are going to be able to serve in that area too. With having to do church online at the moment, we need people who've got technical and creative skills to help us produce videos. But I don't want those needs to be what drives our motivation in these things, because it needs to be about what Jesus is calling us to, not about what we as church say needs doing. So yes, think about ways that you may be able to serve and help us out in church. But please don't let that be the main message that you're hearing at this time. The message that I believe God wants us to hear is about what he is calling us to do. He called those fishermen to be fishers of men because of their skill sets that they had in their life. What personality, what skills and what giftings do you bring that Jesus sees in you and that he is going to call you to bring to his purpose? What might you need to drop and leave behind? Who is he calling you to serve with? And ultimately, are you a fan or are you a follower? Will you take that fandom to the next step and trust him enough to follow where he leads you?